Thank you, Noreen. It's always a great pleasure to be back here and to talk about Proust to this public. For a man who didn't like women, I have to say that it's true that Proust really created a large number of fascinating ladies. It goes from the cook Françoise to the Duchess Oriane. But I think that the two most important female characters in the book are Albertine and Odette. Peace, Caroline, she's going to shoot me because she's working on the Duchess. But I'm standing my ground because with the affair with, or should I say, the search for Albertine is absolutely crucial to the understanding of the narrator. And without Odette, well, there would be no Swann. Now, it is very difficult to imagine two characters more different than Odette and Albertine. And I'm not only talking about difference in personalities, but the difference in the construction of the character. Albertine is the most elusive character of the whole book. Actually, nobody really knows what she wants, what she does. You don't even really know if she's beautiful or not. It depends on the moment. And as to stress the impossibility of catching her, the narrator always compares her to a bird. And that goes from the very beginning, when she's a free seagull on the beach at Balbec, to the very end when she's captive in the apartment, and he talks of his beautiful caged bird. And of course, the element of Albertine, she always evokes for the narrator the sea, the ever-changing sea. Odette, on the contrary, is the most consistent, I think, of the characters in La Recherche. She is the most realistic. She just doesn't change that much from the beginning to the end. Of course, it helps that as Odette figures in Swann in Love, the novel told by by an all-knowing author, there is an objective view of Odette. You have a sense of what the author wanted you to believe in. And of course, she is seen by many, many characters. Albertine is mainly seen through the eyes of the narrator. Odette, everybody has a look at Odette. You know, the narrator, the narrator's family, the Verdurin, the Guermantes, and everybody agrees on the fact that Odette is beautiful and that virtue is not her strong point. So, who is Odette? Well, Odette is a cocotte, to use Proust's name. And in the classical translation, in the Moncrief Kilmartin, cocotte is translated by courtesan. And this is not quite right. A cocotte is not a courtesan. A cocotte is a step down. A courtesan is a public figure. She occupies central stage. She goes out. She has to be seen. And she is so expensive that it is de rigueur for her to have several lovers spend their fortune to keep her in good shape. Odette is much more discreet. She is more modest. You might remember that she does not want to participate in Swann's grand social life, and she doesn't want to because Odette really wants to get married. She wants to get married to the right man, that is, to a rich man. And she is a little bit afraid that if she goes out with Swann, she will provoke unpleasant revelations that might thwart her ultimate goal. So Odette, I know you've all read the book probably, but I think perhaps I could recapitulate a bit her career. Her beginnings are really sordid. She was born in a very lower class family. We learned completely at the end of the novel that she is a cousin of Jupien, the vest maker. And she is sold by her mother at a very young age to a rich Englishman who lives in Nice. She doesn't stay long with the Englishman, perhaps just enough to learn a few English expressions that she will use judiciously throughout her career. She makes her way to Paris. She gets to mingle in a sort of bohemian crowd. She perhaps does a little bit of theater. She sleeps with Elstir. And then finally she manages to get married to a very respectable gentleman called Monsieur de Crécy. but she goes through his money very swiftly, so she doesn't stay long with him. And she sort of continues on a career of mainly constituted by the entertainment of rich older gentlemen. Actually, the first time the narrator sees her, it is at his grand uncle Adolphe, where he goes to pay him a visit, and he stumbles upon this visitor, a very pretty lady in pink with a long pearl necklace, nibbling on a clementine, and going on about the cigarettes that her friend the Grand Duke provides her with. Now, I have to mention that there's a little chronological glitch here, which is not unusual in Proust, because if the narrator is 8 or 10 at that moment, it means that Gilberte, Odette and Swann's daughter, is the same age. By the time Gilberte is a 10-year-old, I don't think that Madame Swann would go on calling for gentlemen in the afternoon, but let's not nitpick. And let's go back to Odette, when the reader really gets to know her better, is at the Verdurin, you know, the bourgeois art lover who have this sort of curious salon where no respectable woman really stays very long, so that somebody like Odette, who is pretty and charming and entertaining and easy, is most welcome. So Odette and Proust again is going to specify that she, at this point, she is a demi-mondaine, and to make his point, Proust is going to give us a very detailed description of her house. She lives in a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, and the description of the interior is extraordinarily detailed. I think it's one of the most detailed of the whole novel. And it's a house full of cushions, very low-lit lamps, perfumed, full of flowers, of course, Japanese bibelots, Chinese drapes, etc. And in one of his inside jokes, Proust is going to pluck from Alexandre Dumas' La Dame aux Camélias. You know, La Dame aux Camélias is, of course, Marie Duplessis, who was the most celebrated courtesan of the times. He is going to pluck the description that Dumas does of the salon of Marie Duplessis and stick it in Odette's interior without changing a word. So, if you happen to read at the same time and to remember at the same time La Dame aux Camélias and La Recherche du Temps Perdu, you can get the joke. Otherwise, it's lost. But I'm sure it amused Proust. Anyway, Odette is looking actually for a protector, and she's not shy about telling Madame Verdurin that she has no one. But she finds him through Charlus. Curiously, she's very good friends with Charlus, and apparently they paint the town together, they go to wide parties, and if you are to believe Charlus, I don't always believe everything Charlus says, Charlus even slept with Odette at one point. Anyway, Charlus thinks it might be a good idea to introduce Odette to Swann, which he does. And Swann is interested, not that interested. She's not exactly the kind of woman who attracts him. She does look like a Botticelli, which of course satisfies his aesthetic instincts. And more than that, she's extremely nice and sweet and tender to him. And so little by little, he's more than happy to spend part of the evenings with her, and she brings him to the Verdurin. But he's very slow and very shy, and it irritates Odette a little bit. She would like things to sort of heat up a little bit. And I don't know if she does it on purpose. I believe she does. One evening, Swann arrives, and she is not there. And this unexpected absence sort of triggers his love, which is going to be fueled by jealousy. And from that moment on, things get really going between them, and they finally sleep together. But then a sort of hellish period begins for Swann because he's tortured by jealousy. But we're not talking about Swann tonight, we're talking about Odette. And Odette is going to show her true nature at that point. Once she understands that Swann is hooked, she does not feign any affection for him. She knows she can do whatever she wants. He's not going to leave her. So she accepts money. She accepts huge sums of money, large presents, and actually treats him very cruelly. You have the impression that she lost all respect for him. She doesn't bother letting him know when she comes back to town, though she knows how important it is for him to come and see her. She's really very nasty, but he doesn't leave her. And this goes on for years until finally she leaves for a long cruise with the Verdurins. She leaves for about 2 years, and he slowly detaches himself from her. And Swann's in love ends with the famous declaration, Swann declaring, "To think that I've wasted years of my life, that I've longed to die, that I've experienced my greatest love for a woman who didn't appeal to me, who wasn't even my type." End of story? Of course not. By the next page, they're married. And this marriage is one of the great surprises of La Recherche, and it's something that really puzzles readers. Of course, it puzzles readers who stop their reading at Swann in Love, because the explanation comes later. And I think it even puzzles first-time readers, because there's so much information in that book that you can't really absorb everything at the first reading. So there are explanations to this marriage. And the first one is given by Monsieur de Norpois. Monsieur de Norpois, you know, is a diplomat. He's a rather malicious gossip. He's a friend of the narrator's father. And the narrator's family is rather interested by Swann's interior. And Norpois explains the marriage by telling them that though the affair was cooling, Swann and Odette apparently had a child together. Of course, Proust never bothers telling his reader that the child existed, but the child is there. And apparently Swann was very taken by that child and liked to come and see her, and was very moved by the little girl. And Odette, who wanted to get married, that was her real ambition, is to get married, is to get Swann to marry her, sees that the girl is her last chance. And according to Norpois, she uses the child in a way as a sort of emotional blackmail. And she would take away the child whenever Swann refused her something. Poor Swann, adds Norpois, who is as naive as he is in other ways discerning, believed every time that the disappearance of the child was a coincidence. Apart from that, she made such continual scenes that everyone expected that as soon as she achieved her object and was safely married, their life would be a hell on earth. Instead of which, just the opposite happened. So it would seem that Swann married mainly in order to keep his child. But the narrator has another explanation. Now, this is not the young narrator, it's the old narrator looking back on his life and that of others. And the narrator thinks that Odette and Swann had been together for so long, that Odette knew him so intimately, that she was like an old comfortable slipper. And Swann is lazy, Swann is lonely, Swann has abandoned all social ambitions once he has attained his grand position at the Guermantes. Besides, he knows perfectly well that as a Jew, he will never be able to make the grand marriage that he had once dreamed upon. And so he finally goes for the most comfortable thing and marries Odette. Now, for those of you who might find that explanation a little bit insufficient, I would like to point out something. You know that Proust was a great, great reader of Chateaubriand. Mm-hmm. Now, it happens that Chateaubriand married a woman that he didn't like, that offered him absolutely no material advantages, who never read a word he had written. So she was like a sort of heavy weight that he had to. And why did he marry her? He explains it. He says that he was so tired of the nagging of his sister and his mother, who wanted him to marry the girl, that he finally gave in. And I imagine that Proust thought, well, this is a little bit what my Swann is doing. There's a laziness, a lassitude in Swann that is very real and explains a lot about the man. Anyway, they get married, and even married, of course, Odette remains some kind of an outcast. She is not received by Swann's family. She is, of course, not received by the bourgeoisie in Combray, and of course not by the Guermantes world. So she has to do with government officials, some old friends from the Verdurin days, and the only person of note that she manages to attract is Bergotte, the writer. And this is important for her because Bergotte is so well known that a lot of intelligent, elegant men are happy to come to the Swanns in order to speak and to chat with Bergotte. Now, her house is not elegant in the sense of old money elegance, which is the elegance that Swann was accustomed to. Odette adopts all the latest trends. There's a certain vulgarity of the nouveau riche in that house. But Proust wants to make sure that the reader realizes that she never shakes off her former self, the cocotte in her. And here is how the narrator describes her smile during the daily outing Odette takes at the Bois. I read in her ambiguous smile the provocative smile of the courtesan, which she graciously bestowed upon the man who greeted her. This smile was in reality saying to one, "Oh yes, I remember very well, it was wonderful." To another, "How would I have loved to? It was bad luck." To a third, "Yes, if you like, I must follow the procession for a moment, but then as soon as I can, I'll break away." As for certain men only, she had a sour, strange, shy, cold smile, which meant, "Yes, you old goat, I know that you have a tongue like a viper that you can't keep quiet for a moment, but do you suppose that I care?" Another pair of strollers would say to each other, "You know who that is? Madame Swann? That doesn't mean anything to you? Odette de Crécy, then? Odette de Crécy? But I say, she can't be as young as all that. Hey, I remember I slept with her on the day MacMahon resigned." So the only thing that Odette does really, really well is to choose her outfits. Even the Duchess, who is not apt to compliment other women, admits that she is marvelously turned out. And Proust describes these dresses lovingly, but he also interprets them. And the particular attention he pays to her peignoirs are interesting. A peignoir is a very elegant and pretty dressing gown. It is curiously translated by housecoat. This is a horrible translation. A peignoir is a sexy, very intimate garment. It's impossible to imagine Oriane receiving anybody in a peignoir. Well, a housecoat is simply something easy and practical to slip into. Odette's peignoir, and she spends a lot of time in her peignoirs, and she has a great collection of them, are anything but practical. One would often find her in a marvelous garment of crêpe de Chine, or silk, old rose, cherry-colored tiepolo pink, white, mauve, green or yellow, solid or patterned, in which she had sat down to lunch. A great courtesan, such as she had been, lives largely for her lovers, that is to stay at home. The culminating point of her day is not the moment in which she dresses herself for society, but that in which she undresses herself for a man. She must be as elegant in her dressing gown, in her nightdress, as in her outdoor attire. So you see what I mean. She's a cocotte through and through, and you're never allowed to forget it. Now, I have to say that she has a very keen understanding of her position, and she does not try to impose herself where she knows she is not wanted. For instance, she's very hospitable to the narrator, but she doesn't seem to mind that the parents of the narrator ignore her completely. One of the curious rules of French etiquette in this delicate matter is that ladies of good society could greet and converse with dubious ladies outdoors. That did not set any obligations. So when Mr. and Madame Swann take a walk in the zoo, for instance, Odette could point out to Swann such and such distinguished lady whom he may not have noticed, and the lady would stop, glad of an opportunity to make a show of courtesy to Madame Swann that will not set a tiresome precedent, one of which they all knew that she would never take inappropriate advantage, for instance, by undertaking to call on them or to leave her cards. So thoroughly had Swann trained her in reserve. She had even acquired all the manners of polite society. But still, it does not help her gain the respect of that society. And I have to point out that even the people who come to her house, and I'm thinking of Bergotte, the wonderful, delicate, subtle artist that Bergotte is, who is received so generously by the Swanns, is pretty horrible when he talks about Odette. Coming out with the narrator of a lunch, he tells the narrator, Swann really needs a good doctor. Why, says the poor narrator. Well, don't you see how tense he is? He's typical of a man who has married a whore and has to pocket a dozen insults a day from women who refuse to meet his wife or men who have slept with her. So now, how does Odette claw her way up? How does she manage to marry her daughter to Robert de Saint-Loup, the most elegant and sought-after young man of the aristocratic society of the time? And don't forget that Saint-Loup, a few years ago, had refused to be introduced to her because, as he said very elegantly, she's an old tart. Well, it's sad to say, but the death of Swann allows her ascent. Even before Swann dies, Odette grasped that the way up was to take the road of nationalism. So even though Swann is a very ardent pro-Dreyfus partisan, she takes the opposite road, and she gets to be received in a few nationalists' salons. When Swann dies, of course it serves her purpose because the Jewish element of her union is cancelled. Swann has left her very well off, and her fortune, if not her good looks, tempt her old lover Forcheville, who marries her. But he marries her after having made sure that his family would receive his wife. So there she is, she marries Forcheville. Her daughter Gilberte does something horrible. She allows herself to be adopted by Forcheville and takes Forcheville's name. Even though her great attraction to mothers who are looking for a wife for their sons is the huge fortune she has acquired because she has inherited from one of Swann's uncles. But anyway, there is the Forcheville ladies who are more and more part of the nationalist salon. And the whole landscape has now changed. Madame de Marsantes accepts Gilberte as a daughter-in-law. She marries Robert de Saint-Loup. So newcomers in society are convinced that Madame de Forcheville is a real lady because she is the mother of Gilberte de Saint-Loup, who is the niece of the Duc de Guermantes. Her beginnings are forgotten. But has she changed? I'm not sure. And this is why I said at the beginning of this talk that she's extraordinarily consistent. She still is at heart a kept woman, a cocotte. Consider her relationship with her son-in-law, Robert. Age had left Madame Swann, now Madame de Forcheville, with the taste she had always had of being kept. She longed every day for a new necklace, a new dress studded with brilliants, but she only had a small income. At that time, Forcheville had died, and Forcheville had actually gone through her own fortune. Then suddenly, she had sniffed out and found her natural protector in Robert. That she was no longer in her first youth mattered little. All he asked was his mother-in-law to smooth down any difficulty that might arise between Gilberte and himself. I have to add that to give you a sense of the moral turpitude of all this arrangement, is that Robert needs money because he needs money to pay his male lover. So and he has no money, so the money comes from Gilberte. Now Odette, having applied herself to convince her daughter to be more generous with her husband, was at once rewarded with a magnificent ruby. To pay for this, it was necessary for Gilberte to be more generous with her husband. Odette urged her in this direction with all the more fervor in that it was she herself who would benefit. Thus, thanks to Robert, she was enabled on the threshold of her 50s, some said her 60s, to dazzle every table where she died. Now, does the death of Robert de Saint-Loup mark the end of her career? Of course not. She makes one final conquest, a completely improbable one, that of the Duke de Guermantes. And the Duke proves himself a demanding and jealous lover. He insisted that she should lunch and dine with him, and he was always in her house. It was true that Madame de Forcheville had long ago become a society lady, but starting again late in life to be kept, and to be kept by an old man of such enormous pride, she was herself not too proud to wear only those peignoirs which pleased him, to serve him only the dishes that he liked, and to flatter her friends by telling them that she had spoken of them to her new lover, just as in the old days she would tell my great uncle that she had spoken of him to the Grand Duke who sent her cigarettes. In a word, in spite of all she had accomplished in building up a social position, she was tending under pressure of new circumstances to become once more, as she had appeared to me in my earliest childhood, the lady in pink. She had come full circle. It's difficult to be more consistent than that.